Welcome, dear friends, to Moonlight Audiobook. I am Brandon, your host for today's mystery. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'm so glad you've joined me. In this video, I invite you to step into the past, a past stained by betrayal, obsession, and a murder that never quite rested in peace. 16 years ago, Caroline Crale was convicted of poisoning her husband, the celebrated painter Crayle. She died in prison, but now her daughter wants the truth. Was Caroline truly guilty? Or was she protecting someone else? This is Hercule Poirot, The Mystery of Five Little Pigs by Agatha Christie. Now, get yourself comfortable. Settle in with a warm drink, dim the lights, let us begin. Chapter 1. A Letter from the Past. The Cornish coast shimmered beneath a gentle haze that blurred the horizon into a silver-grey ribbon. Waves lapped against the rocks with a rhythm that felt ancient, indifferent, and oddly expectant. On the cliffs above, Alderbury House stood solitary and dignified, its stone facade softened by ivy and sea wind, as if time had brushed over it rather than battered it. The house had always seemed more like a monument than a home, not just to its architecture, but to the tragedy that once played out within its walls. 16 years ago, Crayle, the celebrated painter, iconoclast, and subject of gossip in artistic circles, had died there, poisoned by a tincture of codeine. His death had stunned society and condemned his wife, Caroline Crale, to a life behind bars. It had been a scandal that rippled through drawing rooms and smoke-filled galleries from Mayfair to Montparnasse. Now, more than a decade and a half later, the house stood quiet once more, the past thick in its shadows, awaiting a reckoning it did not expect. Into this stillness came Carla Lamarchant, daughter of the convicted woman. Her features bore echoes of Caroline, the strong chin, the keen eyes, though softened by something less volatile. Dressed plainly and carrying a slim leather satchel, she paused before entering the house, as if listening for the breath of old ghosts. She had returned not for sentiment, but for truth. A letter, yellowed and creased with age, had altered the course of her life. It had arrived in a stack of legal documents, among the effects of an aunt recently deceased. In it, Caroline Crale, writing with an urgent finality, swore to her daughter that she had not murdered her husband. The courts had declared otherwise. So had society. But Carla Lamarchant, raised across the Atlantic and long sheltered from the brutal weight of the case, had made a quiet vow: if there was even a splinter of doubt in her mother's guilt, she would unearth it. No matter how many years had passed. No matter whom it implicated. The solicitor accompanying her, Miss Felicity Greer, was a pragmatic woman with tightly set lips and an efficient step. She had advised caution. Carla had insisted on action. And so, a single name had been written on a folded slip of paper and sent to London. A name known in whispers and in headlines. A name revered by those who had something to hide, and sought by those with something to uncover. Hercule Poirot. He arrived without fanfare, stepping from the black motorcar like a man taking the air before tea. He was a small figure of careful symmetry, a silhouette too neat for English weather. Every detail was exact: the gloved hands, the glossy shoes, the dark grey suit with lavender pinstripe, pressed into sharp edges. His moustaches, groomed to perfection, twitched faintly as he surveyed the grounds of Alderbury House with the mild expression of one preparing to trim a rose garden, delicate work, but not without danger. He greeted Miss Greer with a courteous bow and regarded Carla with gentle scrutiny. "They say," he began, with his faintly amused Belgian accent, "that justice is blind, mademoiselle. I, Hercule Poirot, prefer to think she merely squints." Inside, in the drawing-room where the death had occurred, Poirot did not pace, nor peer for traces of old crimes. He did not ask for photographs or fingerprints. Instead, he asked for memories. Names. And there were 5. 5 people had been present in that house during the summer of Crale's death. 5 whose lives had intersected with the painter's genius, and with the woman imprisoned for ending it. First, there was Philip Blake, a man of calculation and cold precision. Amias's closest friend, he had once declared emotion a disease and Caroline Crale its most toxic symptom. Second was Meredith Blake, Philip's elder brother, an eccentric herbalist and recluse who had once dabbled in the study of rare plants. It was from his collection that the poison had allegedly come. Third stood Lady Dittisham, formerly Elsa Greer, once a model, now a baroness, and the only woman Amias had intended to marry after his divorce. Her beauty had faded into elegance, but her past had never quite loosened its grip. Fourth was Cecilia Williams, the strict, sharp-minded governess who had governed Carla's early years with unwavering discipline and rigid morality. She had seen everything, remembered everything, and perhaps forgiven nothing. And finally, there was Angela Warren, Caroline's half-sister. 16 at the time of the murder, Angela had been the wild card. Brilliant, moody, scarred both physically and emotionally by a childhood accident for which Caroline had once been blamed. A paperweight flung in anger. A face permanently marked. And yet, Angela had loved her sister fiercely, or so the letters claimed. 5 people. 5 potential murderers. Each with motive. Each with proximity. Each now scattered across their own carefully reconstructed lives. Poirot, seated by the cold hearth, tapped a finger gently on the armrest of his chair. To solve a murder long past, he said softly, one must see not with the eyes of today, but with the eyes of yesterday. One must peel away what time has softened. People forget. People rearrange. People deceive even themselves. He paused. But they do not change. Not in the ways that matter. The sea wind beat gently against the windows as if knocking for permission to enter. Poirot did not stir. 5 little pigs, he murmured, as though reciting a rhyme. Miss Greer turned to him, puzzled. I beg your pardon. Poirot gave a faint smile. A nursery rhyme, mademoiselle. 5 little pigs, one stayed at home, one had roast beef, one had none, one cried all the way home, and one committed a murder. The silence that followed was not empty, but taut, like a curtain drawn across a darkened stage, awaiting the opening act. Poirot stood. It is time, I think, he said, to gather the pigs. And with that, he departed, leaving behind the stillness of Alderbury House, and carrying with him the dusted fragments of a case long thought closed, fragments he would reassemble not with force, but with thought. The little grey cells were awake. And the hunt had begun. Chapter 2, 5 Portraits in Memory. The case began not with confrontation, but with quiet footsteps. Hercule Poirot moved through the present as if walking a museum of the past, peering into polished lives that had been built over something crumbling beneath. He sought not confessions, but contradictions. Not evidence, but memory. And memory, he knew, was a traitor with a polished smile. His first call was upon Philip Blake, now a retired stockbroker residing in a handsome townhouse in Kensington. The man who had once scoffed at sentiment and extolled the virtues of precision now wore his wealth-like armor, silk cravat, rosewood pipe, polished leather slippers. His drawing-room smelled of tobacco and privilege. Poirot observed the surroundings before he observed the man. A mounted trout above the mantel. A framed certificate from Cambridge. Nothing personal. Nothing warm. Philip Blake greeted Poirot with professional courtesy and a gaze that hinted at controlled irritation. He had the look of a man who disliked introspection and distrusted emotion. There is no point in dragging it all up again, he said, not quite meeting Poirot's eyes. The case was closed. Caroline was guilty. Damned shame, of course, but some women simply don't have the temperament for rejection. Poirot said little. He merely listened. He asked after Blake's memory of the summer. Blake recited facts like a ledger, dates, times, positions. Yet in his neatness, Poirot saw evasion. The man remembered too clearly what he had seen, and not at all what he had felt. Poirot made a polite departure, but noted the tremble in the man's hand as he lit his second pipe. Something gnawed beneath that tidy exterior. Something unfinished. Meredith Blake was another matter altogether. He lived alone in a crumbling manor near Devon, the house swallowed in ivy and silence. The garden, once orderly, had gone wild, a living metaphor for the man himself. He met Poirot in a woolen jumper streaked with soil and spoke in wondering, diffident tones. Meredith had once been a keen amateur botanist, and his eyes still lit up at the mention of rare species. He spoke at length of the Conium maculatum, hemlock, as though discussing an old acquaintance. "I kept it for study, of course. No harm intended," he mumbled. "No one imagined, no one believed Caroline would use it. She was rather volatile, yes, but murder? It always seemed so theatrical." Poirot studied Meredith's thin, pale hands as they trembled over a teacup. He did not interrupt the rambling. Meredith's mind worked like a worn watch, inconsistent, but not broken. There was something pitiable about the man. And yet, pity, Poirot knew, could be a veil. Meredith had lived in that house with the poison. He had not raised alarm. He had said little then. He said little now. But in the quiet tremor of his voice, Poirot sensed a fear not of guilt, but of what guilt might be uncovered. Lady Dittisham, formerly Elsa Greer, was living in a house of glass and mirrors, a sleek estate in Surrey where beauty was curated like a museum piece. Time had not erased her charm, it had refined it, sculpted her into an image of wealth and elegant detachment. She greeted Poirot in a pale silk gown, her tone amused and languid. "I suppose you've come to dig up old scandals," she said, smiling with lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Do be careful. The past is a fragile thing." Her voice carried the lazy poise of someone who had never been denied anything, except, perhaps, one man. Amias Crayle had been her obsession. She admitted as much with a soft sigh and the toss of a gold bracelet. "I loved him, of course. Passionately. Why else would I have waited for him to leave her? He promised me everything." Poirot did not flinch. He merely folded his gloved hands and tilted his head. "And when he refused?" Elsa's smile did not waver. "He didn't refuse. He hesitated. Amias always hesitated. He loved his painting more than he loved anyone." Poirot noted the choice of words. Not her, anyone. Elsa had buried her fury in diamonds and silk, but the pulse of it still beat beneath the skin. There was a woman who had been spurned, and a woman who had not forgiven. And in the perfumed stillness of that immaculate sitting room, Poirot felt something cold at the edges. Not guilt, but calculation. Cecilia Williams, the governess, now lived in a modest flat in Hampstead. She had aged into austerity, plain skirt, grey cardigan, hair tied tightly at the nape. There was steel in her spine and moral judgment in her voice. She remembered the Crayle household with precision and a lack of sentiment that impressed even Poirot. "There was no discipline," she said crisply. "Amias Crayle was a man of no principles. Caroline was unstable. Elsa Greer was a child playing at passion. And the Blake brothers, each weak in his own way. I did my best to protect Carla from the chaos." Poirot listened without speaking. It was not that Miss Williams lacked feeling, it was that she saw feeling as a weakness. Yet her eyes, sharp behind rimless spectacles, betrayed flickers of something deeper. Regret? Perhaps. Or suppressed loyalty. She had remained silent all those years. Not out of ignorance, Poirot sensed, but out of duty. She had believed the official story because it had preserved order. And order was, to Cecilia Williams, the highest virtue. But virtue, Poirot knew, could also be a disguise. The final visit took him to a university in Cambridge, where Angela Warren now lectured in archaeology. She moved with purpose and spoke with the clipped confidence of someone long accustomed to skepticism. The scar that ran down the side of her face, a remnant of the paperweight thrown in childhood, had faded but not vanished. Angela met Poirot without pleasantries. She disdained nostalgia. Her words were brisk, her eyes alert. "I loved my sister," she said, flatly. "Despite everything. She was temperamental, yes. Capable of rage, certainly. But I do not believe she murdered him." Poirot noticed she never referred to Amias by name. He asked about the summer. Angela replied with dates, names, arguments overheard. She did not flinch from the past. In fact, she seemed to have dissected it, catalogued it, as one might an ancient ruin. "I remember," she said, "what no one else bothered to. That's what you need, isn't it? Memory untainted by illusion." Poirot gave no answer. He merely rose and thanked her. As he left the stone university halls behind, he allowed himself a single breath of thought. 5 people. 5 accounts. 5 truths, each warped by time, by emotion, by guilt or its absence. And yet, somewhere in the space between their memories and their omissions, the shape of a single, hidden truth had begun to emerge. Chapter 3. The Crayle Household. The true investigation, Hercule Poirot often said, begins only once the polite interviews have commenced. Not when facts are gathered, but when faces are studied, intonations marked, and deflections catalogued. It was not what people said that interested Poirot, it was what they avoided, what they rewrote, and what, through habit or guilt, they had convinced themselves to believe. His task was not merely to ask, but to disrupt. To unsettle just enough to crack the veneer of years. He began with Meredith Blake. The sitting room in Meredith's overgrown estate was a quiet prison of faded wallpaper and threadbare books. Meredith had prepared an entire tray of herbal infusions for Poirot, explaining the calming properties of each leaf with rambling enthusiasm. He pored over every blend except one, the hemlock, which sat in its glass jar, ominously untouched. Poirot did not interrupt the ritual. Instead, he watched the man as one might observe a rare bird whose movements suggested the echo of some long-forgotten trauma. At last, Meredith sighed and leaned back. "I suppose you want me to talk about Caroline?" Poirot merely nodded. Meredith's voice drifted. She was magnificent in a way. Proud. She burned hot. But there was sadness in her, even before Amias. She believed in love, and I think it destroyed her. Poirot tilted his head. "Do you think she murdered him?" There was a pause, brittle and delicate. "No," said Meredith, at last. "I believed it then. I'm not sure I do now. I think Caroline was the kind to break her own heart before she'd take someone else's life." Poirot noted the phrase. Not incapable. Not innocent. But unsuited. A moral distinction, not a legal one. Meredith would not defend her outright. But he could not condemn her, either. Poirot stood slowly, his voice light. "The hemlock, monsieur, it is still in your keeping." "Yes, yes," Meredith replied, gesturing vaguely. "Under lock now. I never disposed of it." Poirot gave a small nod, though his eyes remained on the man. "A strange thing, is it not?" he said. "To keep close the very thing that once caused suspicion. Almost as if to preserve the memory." Meredith said nothing. His hands trembled slightly in his lap. The next interview took place over clinking glassware and the faint hum of jazz. Philip Blake had chosen a gentleman's club in Pall Mall for the setting, insisting on a more civilized environment for discussing what he referred to as ancient drama. He spoke with the assurance of a man who believed time had absolved him of involvement. But Poirot, sipping his tea slowly, recognized the signs, deflection through bravado, sarcasm as a shield. Caroline was the volatile type, Blake declared, puffing on his pipe. Beautiful in a wintry way, but mad as a box of frogs. Amias couldn't stand it after a while. Honestly, we all saw it coming. And yet, Poirot said softly, you remained in the house. You, who disliked her so intensely. Philip offered a smile. I was Amias's friend. My presence was insurance. Against what? Poirot asked. Philip looked away, tapping ash onto a bronze tray. Against drama. She had a temper. One never knew. There it was, the distancing of responsibility, the insertion of control. Poirot pressed no further, but took note. Philip had come not to support, but to watch. And the watcher, Poirot knew, often saw more than he admitted. Cecilia Williams received him in her modest sitting room with a neat pot of tea and 2 perfectly aligned chairs. Every object had a place, every book spine faced the same direction. Her presence radiated control, not of people, but of circumstance. She folded her hands in her lap as Poirot began. Miss Williams, he said, your recollections of that summer are detailed. You kept a journal, did you not? I did. I found it necessary in that household. Caroline's moods, Amias's absences, Elsa's presence, none conducive to a child's moral formation. You disapproved of Elsa Greer? I pitied her, Cecilia replied. She mistook infatuation for purpose. She played the muse and thought herself the heroine. Poirot allowed a pause. And of Caroline? A flicker, hardly noticeable, passed across the governess's brow. She was intelligent, capable of great depth, but too proud to ask for help. She wouldn't speak of her fears. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And what did she fear, Miss Williams? Another pause. This one deeper. That Amias would leave her, she said. Not just for Elsa, for any new canvas that caught his eye. Caroline feared becoming irrelevant. And the day he died? Poirot asked. Cecilia's voice lowered. She was very quiet. Still. Too still. I thought she had accepted something terrible. Poirot rose slowly. Acceptance, he said gently, is not always the same as guilt. Cecilia Williams did not reply. Elsa Greer, now Lady Dittisham, had agreed to a second conversation, this time in her garden loggia, surrounded by manicured hedges and marble sculptures. She sat like a portrait, painted in grace and silks, her face unreadable. I suppose I still fascinate you, she said coolly. You men always return to the scene, don't you? Poirot regarded her with calm detachment. I return not for the scene, madam, but for the truth. Elsa waved a hand. I adored Amias. He was selfish and brilliant and utterly careless. But he painted me as no one else could. He saw me. Did he love you? She laughed, softly, bitterly. Only his art. He needed me for a masterpiece. Beyond that, who can say? Poirot inclined his head. And yet, you remained. Her eyes sharpened. I thought I could endure anything. I thought he would come to me, eventually. He promised he would. Poirot's voice dropped. But on the day of his death, he told Caroline he would not leave her, did he not? Elsa's mouth thinned. She did not confirm or deny. She merely looked away. The silence stretched. Poirot understood. The wound, though dulled by years, had never quite scarred over. Angela Warren met him again, this time in the university gardens. She walked briskly, as if attempting to outpace the questions she knew would come. You've seen them all, haven't you? She said. Each with their little lies. Poirot did not answer. Angela stopped beside a bench. They all hated Caroline, in one way or another. All judged her. and none of them understood her. And you? Poirot asked. Angela looked into the trees, her face half-shadowed. I loved her. Even after the accident. Even after the trial. She was the only person who ever treated me as whole. Poirot's voice was soft. And did she kill Amias? Angela closed her eyes briefly. I don't know. I want to believe she didn't. But something broke in her that day. Something I'd never seen before. Poirot nodded once. Sometimes the most honest answer, he reflected, was also the most useless. But even in uncertainty, there were clues. Fear spoke. Love lied. And truth concealed itself in contradiction. By the end of the week, Poirot had assembled not a timeline, but a map of human emotion. Each interview had been a brushstroke. Together they painted a portrait of a summer rotting at its core. The time had come, he knew, to examine not what happened, but what each believed had happened. And somewhere in those beliefs, carefully folded and kept for 16 years, was the key to murder. Chapter 4: The Botanist and the Ghost. It was in the quiet hours following his interviews that Hercule Poirot allowed the case to drift, deliberately, toward the obvious. Every investigation, he believed, must flirt with the mistaken. Only in following the wrong thread could one detect the subtle resistance of truth, that taut pull that revealed misdirection. And in this case, the thread led straight to Philip Blake. Blake had shown little grief, then or now. His recollections had been too smooth, his narrative too prepared. Of all the witnesses, he alone framed Caroline Crale as unstable, and he alone insisted, even now, that her guilt was self-evident. Poirot sat before his carefully organized notes. Philip Blake had been in the garden at the critical hour. He had fetched the beer, so he claimed, and had passed near the library where the poison, later found in the studio, had been stored. It was enough to raise suspicion. Enough, in fact, to bring the Scotland Yard inspector out of polite retirement for a conversation. Inspector Hale, lean, white-haired, and precise, met Poirot in a discreet corner of a Bloomsbury café. He had presided over the Crayle case all those years ago and had since turned his talents to writing war memoirs and solving minor countryside mysteries for his parish paper. He listened now as Poirot laid out his suggestion. Philip Blake, Hale said, raising an eyebrow. Not the likeliest, I'd have thought. But the most confident, Poirot replied. He expresses certainty where there should be doubt. He claims to have witnessed Caroline's instability, but provides no true example of danger. And more intriguingly, he admits to fetching the beer. That beer, said Hale thoughtfully. The one Amias drank shortly before collapsing. Poirot gave a small smile. Just so. The beer that was poisoned. Hale considered this, tapping a finger lightly against the rim of his coffee cup. You think he introduced the codeine? I do not think, said Poirot. I observe. And I observe that Philip Blake had both opportunity and motive. He let the silence hold for a moment before continuing. Consider, mon ami, the psychological undercurrent. Philip Blake admired Amias, perhaps even depended on him. But if Amias were about to abandon his wife, and by extension, the circle of friends that revolved around his home, what then? Would Philip not have felt betrayal? Hale frowned. Bit of a stretch. Poirot inclined his head. Perhaps. But tell me, why, after 16 years, does he still speak of Caroline with such disdain? Why so certain of her guilt when others have softened? Hale paused. Then he said, what about the journal? The one Miss Williams kept. Poirot pulled from his pocket a folded page, a duplicate copy, carefully transcribed. There is an entry, he said, from the day before the murder. Miss Williams notes that Philip Blake and Meredith were arguing in the orchard. She did not hear the words, but she believed they were disagreeing about something to do with Amias's work. That could mean anything, said Hale. It could, Poirot agreed. Or it could mean that Philip resented the way Amias had become consumed with Elsa Greer. That he viewed it as betrayal, not of marriage, but of art. Blake was not a creative man. He dealt in figures, not inspiration. But he worshipped Amias. And worship, when slighted, turns swiftly to hate. Poirot closed the folder slowly. I do not accuse, he said. But I observe the possibility. Poirot returned to his flat that evening with the sense that a trap had been set, one not for the guilty, but for himself. The case had handed him a plausible villain, wrapped in motive and means. It was too tidy, too pat. He read through the statements again. The accounts clashed only in tone, never in content. Each suspect had shaped the past into something useful, a narrative that suited their moral comfort. But narratives, Poirot knew, were like paintings, truthful only from one distance. Too close, and one saw the brushstrokes, too far, and the picture blurred. It was a remark from Angela Warren that stopped him short. They all hated Caroline, in one way or another. Why had she said that? And more importantly, was it true? He reviewed their testimonies anew. Meredith had admired her quietly, but avoided confrontation. Philip had spoken of her with contempt. Elsa had seemed resentful. Cecilia had respected her mind but doubted her strength. Each had, in some way, distanced themselves from Caroline before the murder. So who, Poirot wondered, had stood with her? Only Angela, the child, the scarred sister, the last to see Caroline as whole. And perhaps that was why Caroline had gone so willingly to the gallows. Not because she was guilty, but because she believed no one would fight for her. That, Poirot thought, was a kind of tragedy too. The next day, he returned to Meredith Blake with a specific purpose. They walked the garden together, stepping over tangled vines and brittle rose beds long past bloom. I want to understand, Poirot said gently, your quarrel with your brother that summer. Meredith blinked. Philip? It was nothing. He wanted to invest in some project of Amias's. A gallery or something. I thought it foolish. Poirot studied him. And did you ever question your brother's certainty? His account of the murder? Meredith hesitated. He was always so forceful. So sure. It was easier to go along. Poirot nodded. That, he thought, was the heart of it, the echo chamber of shared bias. One strong voice shaping weaker ones into agreement. As he left the Blake estate, Poirot no longer doubted that Philip Blake could have poisoned Amias. But he no longer believed that he had. The first false lead had done its job. It had opened a window. The case no longer pointed in a single direction. It fanned outward, revealing inconsistencies, misremembered moments, the warp and weft of damaged memory. What Poirot now required was the contradiction, the one detail that no guilty person could control and no innocent one would think to hide. He turned once more to Cecilia Williams's journal. There, almost overlooked, was an entry timed just an hour before the death. Caroline went down to the orchard. Elsa followed 5 minutes later. I believe I heard Philip on the garden path before that. Angela was upstairs. I heard her moving. The governess's ear, I suppose. Poirot read it twice. Then he smiled. Because the lie, he realized, was not in what they had said, but in when they had said it. Chapter 5. The Governess of Morality. The Devon coast bathed in a thin veil of morning mist as Poirot, seated at a small writing table in the sun-dappled drawing-room of the Crown Hotel, reviewed his meticulous notes. A line of neatly stacked notebooks sat at his elbow, each corresponding to a separate witness. He had asked for no interruptions, save for tea and a small jug of hot milk, which he stirred with deliberation. He had now spoken with all 5 of the little pigs. 5 individuals, 5 versions of the same day, one day 16 years past, preserved in memory like old wine in stained glass. And yet, the light that passed through it now seemed warped. With his pen poised above the page, Poirot drew a single line from left to right across the top margin. He began, not with the murder, but with the morning, always the morning. It was here, in the mundane, where motive often nested unnoticed. 9 a.m. Caroline Crale reportedly awoke late, claiming to have suffered a headache the night before. Elsa Greer, already in the garden by then, recalled seeing Caroline at the upstairs window, wrapped in her dressing gown, watching Amias as he set up his easel near the terrace. 9:15 a.m. Angela Warren had slipped out for a walk along the coastal path, sketchbook in hand. Meredith Blake had retired to his laboratory on the upper floor of the house. Philip Blake was spotted near the orchard, allegedly gathering apples for breakfast. A quiet hour, and yet one wherein alibis tangled already. 10 a.m. Elsa had joined Amias outdoors. Miss Greer was consistent, if vain, in describing the hours she spent posing. Caroline, in her version, loitered in the drawing-room, clearly unhappy. She had said nothing of the poison at that stage. Poirot underlined the time slowly. 11:15 a.m. Meredith had come down to the kitchen to collect a water sample, his notebook in his breast pocket. There, the housekeeper, Miss Larkin, had offered him tea. Caroline had reportedly passed through the corridor moments later, tense, silent. Philip Blake had reappeared about this time, returning from the orchard, although no one could confirm seeing him then. Noon. It was here the accounts grew divergent. Elsa said that Amias complained of feeling faint and went inside for a drink, requesting cold beer. Caroline allegedly retrieved it from the pantry. Within the hour, he collapsed in the garden. Yet Caroline's version, preserved through a letter written to her solicitor before her death, insisted she did not fetch the beer. Meredith claimed to have seen Amias with the glass already in hand when he crossed through the hallway. Angela, meanwhile, returned to the garden at 12:15, where she described seeing Caroline staring at nothing as if frozen in time. Angela remembered Amias lying on the lounger, eyes shut. She had thought he was napping. 12:30 p.m. The screams began. Poirot sat back. He did not smile, he rarely did at this stage of the inquiry. But he had the expression of a man who, in the presence of chaos, found a pattern emerging. Not clarity, but structure. There were discrepancies, not just in recollection but in attitude. Meredith, devoted yet distant, seemed to obscure rather than clarify. Philip, ever judgmental, spoke with certainty as though truth needed reinforcement. Angela, observant but emotional, had a gift for capturing moments others missed. Elsa, prideful, passionate, had her own reasons to shade memory. And Caroline, ever absent, had left behind not just a letter but an enigma. He turned back to his notes. The delivery of the beer was pivotal. If Caroline had not taken the drink to Amias, who had? If Amias fetched it himself, why had no one seen him do so? And how could Meredith, so fastidious, have overlooked something as dramatic as poison being administered under his roof? Poirot closed his eyes, tracing the movements in his mind. The house had multiple access points: the garden doors, the kitchen, the pantry, the hallway. A person could move unseen if they timed it carefully. There had been, too, the strange matter of the missing telegram, a detail Poirot had uncovered through casual conversation with the innkeeper, who recalled a message undelivered from that day. It had been addressed to Amias Crayle from a gallery in London, bearing news of a commission. Whether Amias ever read it was unknown. Why had Caroline not mentioned it? Why had no one? And then, the contradiction. Angela had said she saw Caroline outside staring at nothing at 12:15. But Elsa had sworn that Caroline had been absent from the garden for over half an hour before the incident. Which was true? Or were both false? Poirot stood, brushing invisible dust from his sleeves. A reconstruction of events was insufficient unless it was tested, not against memory, but against motive. He required something more, a rewalk of the scene, yes, but also emotional texture. What did each person stand to lose or gain from Amyas's death? And why had the truth remained dormant for 16 years? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was the bellboy with a small parcel. Poirot signed the ledger and took it inside, opening it delicately. Within, wrapped in silk paper, was a compact sketchbook, Angela Warren's, delivered by courier at his request. The first page bore her scrawled initials and a date. The second showed a landscape, the bluff near Alderbury, the sea whipped into quiet whitecaps. And the third? Poirot inhaled. A drawing, abstract at first glance, then unmistakable. A man, slumped in a recliner, lips parted. In the corner of the page, just after noon AW. This was not memory. This was capture. And unlike memory, drawings did not lie to please others. Poirot's eyes gleamed. He had his pivot. Not the poison. Not the beer. The timing. He turned to his notebook and began to write. Chapter 6. The Scarred Witness. A low wind whispered through the trees surrounding Alderbury House, brushing the ivy-covered walls and rattling a forgotten garden gate that had long since fallen off its hinge. The past, it seemed, was not content to lie still. It breathed through the corridors, nestled between words unspoken, and hovered in the spaces where memory clashed with guilt. Hercule Poirot stood once more on the gravelled path that led to the faded sandstone steps of the house where Amyas Crayle had met his death. Time had not erased the structure's presence, but it had softened it. Moss crept up the base of the pillars, and roses in the side garden had bloomed wild, no longer trimmed with the painter's precise hand. All was slightly untidy, like a memory disturbed. Yet it was precisely this untidiness Poirot sought to understand. Disorder, to his mind, was merely the mask of design. One need only look closely enough. Inside, he had arranged for a gathering, not a formal interrogation, not yet. It would be something subtler, more French than English, a salon of suggestion. In the drawing room, where once Caroline Crale had passed nervously with a book in hand, 5 chairs had been placed in a deliberate semicircle. Poirot took a 6th, slightly apart. The afternoon sun filtered in through gauzy curtains, casting thin shadows like prison bars across the faded carpet. Meredith Blake arrived first, punctual and reserved. He took his seat with the air of a man attending a scientific conference, hands folded. Philip Blake followed, arms crossed, gaze sharp. He seemed perpetually irritated by the process, though Poirot noted he had dressed more formally than their previous meeting. Angela Warren entered shortly after, expression composed but eyes searching. There was something in her manner, an anticipation cloaked in composure. Then came Elsa Greer, now Lady Dittisham, all elegance and clipped vowels. She offered a smile too cool to be genuine and glided into her seat without a word. Poirot observed their interactions keenly. Ilsa did not look at Angela. Philip did not address Meredith. The gaps between their gazes spoke louder than any greeting. He waited a moment longer, then rose. "Miss Amos," he began gently, "I have invited you here not to accuse, but to listen. We are gathered in a place shadowed by a great misfortune. You all knew Amyas Crayle. You knew him in different ways, and you knew him on that final day. I ask you now to return with me, not merely in memory, but in understanding." There was a silence. No one moved. Poirot continued. "I am not interested in mere facts. The facts, they lie in the old reports. I want the truths that live beneath your words. I wish to explore, if you will indulge me, not what happened, but how you felt when it happened." Philip scoffed. "Feelings? That's your method?" Poirot smiled without offense. "Ah, monsieur, do not underestimate les sentiments. The human heart, It leaves footprints. He turned toward Meredith. Monsieur Blake, you spoke of Caroline Crale as quiet, remote, perhaps jealous. Did she ever speak to you directly about Amias and Elsa? Meredith hesitated. Not directly. She made vague remarks. Hints. But did she strike you as a woman on the verge of violence? No. She was controlled. Troubled, yes, but not hysterical. Poirot nodded. And yet, she was convicted. So either her mask was perfect, or someone else's was better. He turned now to Angela. Mademoiselle, you were a child, yes, but a clever one. Your drawings, they show an eye that misses little. Tell me, why did you return to the garden that day? Angela's brow furrowed. I'd left my sketchbook. I wanted to catch the light before it faded. Poirot's voice was soft. And you saw Caroline, standing alone. How did she seem to you? Angela paused. Still. Almost rigid. Like she'd been there for hours or had just arrived. I couldn't tell. And yet Elsa tells us Caroline was inside for most of the hour. Angela glanced sideways at Elsa. She may have been mistaken. Or misled, Poirot said quietly. Lady Dittersham's eyes narrowed. Are you implying I lied, Monsieur Poirot? Non, madam. I imply only that one can describe a scene truthfully and yet distort the truth in doing so. Poirot turned now toward Philip. And you, monsieur? You have always maintained your contempt for Caroline. That she was unstable, possessive. Philip looked irritated. She was. She dragged Amias down. He told me so himself. And yet he painted her. Repeatedly. He pitied her. Poirot's brow lifted. You say pity. I say complexity. Perhaps the greatest mistake made by the Crown was assuming love and hate could not coexist in the same breath. Philip folded his arms tightly. If you've brought us here to paint Caroline as some kind of martyr, I won't be party to it. I seek no martyrs, Poirot said quietly. Only truth. And truth, as you may know, is often hidden behind the convenient lie. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, letting his words settle. Then, with deliberate calm, he brought out Angela's sketchbook. I have here a drawing. Dated, time-marked. A man, in repose. Amias Crayle, just past noon. The room tensed. Why show us this? Elsa asked, voice cool. Because this drawing places him alive at a time some of you suggested he had already begun to decline. The beer, the poison, these came after. Which begs the question, if Caroline did not bring it, who did? Philip rose abruptly. I don't see the point of this. You do, Poirot replied softly. You just do not like the direction it leads. Poirot stood and folded the sketchbook closed. The truth, he said, has been painted over too many times. But like oil on canvas, it bleeds through. And it is beginning to show. He turned and bowed his head gently. Thank you, Miss Amos. I shall trouble you no longer, for today. He left the room in silence, leaving behind not just questions, but discomfort. Not from the past alone, but from what it now threatened to reveal. Chapter 7. The Golden Muse. The morning broke pale and indifferent over Alderbury House. Fog drifted in languid threads across the lawn, creeping like hesitant memories through the open hedgerows. Hercule Poirot, dressed immaculately as ever, stood at the garden's edge, his gloved hands folded behind his back. His gaze was not upon the roses or the hedges, both unkempt now, but upon the ruined stone bench by the sundial, half hidden by overgrowth. Here, he thought, something had been missed. Something not in the files or the testimonies or even the courtroom records. A small detail, a note perhaps, submerged beneath larger revelations, like a pebble overlooked because the boulder nearby had drawn all eyes. He paced slowly, deliberately, allowing the rhythm of the morning to guide his thoughts. Caroline Crale's trial had focused on the file of Conine, the bitter quarrel, the accusations of jealousy. But what if the truth had hidden not in what had been proven, but in what had been forgotten? Later that morning, Poirot called upon Miss Cecilia Williams, the former governess who had once kept a stern and dutiful watch over young Angela Warren. Now retired, she resided in a modest cottage in a village nearby, a life of structure and tea rituals preserved by the ticking of a grandfather clock and the occasional visit from former pupils. Miss Williams received Poirot in her parlour, sitting upright in a stiff-backed chair beside a table of orderly lace and marmalade jars. Her grey eyes regarded him with wary civility. "I wasn't fond of Mr. Crayle," she said plainly after brief pleasantries. "But I am no liar. I told the court all I remembered." "I do not question your honesty, mademoiselle," Poirot said kindly. "But memory, it does not always present its contents in the correct order. Often it conceals the vital thing behind the seemingly mundane." Miss Williams sniffed. "I am not prone to imaginative invention." "Just so," Poirot replied, gently. "Which is why I hope you will indulge me. You were present the morning of Amias Crale's death, were you not?" She nodded. "I was in the schoolroom until shortly before luncheon." "And you recall Angela injuring her wrist?" "Yes. Foolishness on a style. She was careless." "Of course. And Caroline sent Meredith Blake for the sal volatile. Tell me, was that before or after she had her conversation with Elsa Grier on the terrace?" Miss Williams frowned, adjusting the lace cuff on her sleeve. "After, I believe. Though I cannot be certain. Miss Grier was often coming and going." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "But surely, Miss Williams, a woman such as yourself, so precise, so attentive, would notice who used the telephone that day." Her mouth pinched. "The telephone?" "Indeed. Meredith Blake had to call his man to bring the smelling salts, did he not? He could not have brought it from his home in seconds." Miss Williams's brow furrowed. "Now that you mention it, yes. I believe he made a call from the library. But the receiver was off the hook when I went to use it later. Strange. I remember being quite cross." Poirot's eyes glinted. "And the servant, did he say how long the call had lasted?" "I wouldn't know. But I recall hearing Meredith complaining that the line had been engaged when he first picked it up." "Yes, I remember now. He blamed Angela for playing games with it." Poirot sat back, satisfied. "And did she?" Miss Williams paused. "She denied it. And frankly, it didn't strike me as her sort of mischief." Poirot thanked her warmly, and took his leave soon after, his thoughts folding inward like a fan. Back at his lodgings in the village inn, he reviewed his notes, each line, each inconsistency, marked not with red ink, but with the quiet question marks of human behavior. The telephone. Who had used it that morning, and why? He returned to the written testimonies of the time, preserved neatly in his briefcase. Caroline had been in the library briefly that morning. It had been dismissed as unimportant. Yet now, the timing mattered. He traced a timeline. Elsa Grier in the garden. Amias at his easel. Angela injures her wrist. Meredith sent for smelling salts. The telephone line engaged. Caroline in the library. Angela finds Caroline in the garden. Amias collapses. What had been dismissed as coincidence now whispered of something else. A call. Poirot checked the local exchange listings from the period. Few houses had private lines. The call could only have gone to one of a few places, and only one made sense. Meredith's estate. Why would Caroline call his home when Meredith was already present? Unless it had not been Caroline. Or unless someone had meant to ensure Meredith would be occupied, just long enough for. Poirot rose. His eyes narrowed as he approached the window, watching a boy chase a kite across the distant meadow. Some truths hid in distraction, others in what was not said. The line had been engaged, which meant someone, in that brief window, had orchestrated a delay. Not to save a life, but to ensure a death occurred without interruption. And therein lay the clue. Not a footprint. Not a poisoned glass. A telephone, lifted. A delay, manufactured. A witness, displaced. The clue, so small, had been ignored. Forgotten, perhaps, because it was so ordinary. And yet, in that ordinary action lay extraordinary intent. Poirot folded his arms and smiled. The web, once tangled, had begun to loosen. And he would follow its threads, one by one, until the spider at its center revealed itself. Chapter 8. The Poisoned Canvas. The rain returned by midday, whispering against the windows of Poirot's modest room at the village inn, as if nature herself were attempting to scrub the past from memory. But Hercule Poirot, his moustaches freshly waxed and his grey cells stirred to precision, welcomed the storm. It provided the perfect atmosphere for reflection, for inquiry, not into what had happened, but into who had allowed it to happen. On the desk before him, he had arranged 5 sheets of paper, each bearing the name of one of the little pigs, as he had privately dubbed the 5 central witnesses in this drama of the past: Elsa Greer, Meredith Blake, Cecilia Williams, Philip Blake, Angela Warren. Each sheet bore nothing but a name. The facts, he now realized, mattered less than the psychology that sat behind them. He reached for the page labeled Philip Blake, the younger brother of Meredith. A man with little patience, a sharp tongue, and a once-stated loathing of Caroline Crale. In his original testimony, he had painted Caroline as a jealous, brooding woman, incapable of tolerating her husband's interest in younger women. And yet, what had Philip gained from the trial? Poirot's eyes narrowed. Resentment alone did not account for manipulation. He recalled his recent visit with Philip, now a stockbroker in the city. Time had given him a sheen of success, but beneath it, Poirot had sensed something unsettled. Something guarded. Caroline destroyed everything, Philip had said. She killed him. I never forgave her. But his words had rung oddly rehearsed, as though spoken often, not for understanding, but for self-assurance. Poirot moved to the second page, Cecilia Williams. Reliable, prim, upright. She had shown loyalty to Angela Warren and quiet contempt for Elsa Greer. In their interview, she had insisted that Caroline Crale was dignified, even noble, despite the scandal that followed her. She had also expressed clear disdain for Amias Crale's selfishness and philandering. A question formed: could Miss Williams have manipulated events to protect Angela? Had she seen something, overheard something, and held it back? Poirot doubted it. Her mind was moral, but not cunning. Protective, yes, but incapable of orchestration. If she had lied, it had been to shield a child from pain, not to frame a woman for murder. Next, he studied the sheet marked Meredith Blake. A chemist by training, a gentleman by birth, and a man ruled by hesitation. Poirot had met him again only days ago at his crumbling estate, a structure that mirrored its owner, elegant but fragile. Meredith had provided the fatal poison. Not willingly, but through carelessness. The codeine had been kept among other outdated specimens, unsupervised, in a cluttered cabinet. Poirot had asked him, point blank, if he believed Caroline had stolen the poison. She could have, Meredith had murmured. She had access. But, I wonder now. Poirot remembered the faraway look in the man's eyes. She wasn't the only one who visited the lab that summer. But at the time, it didn't occur to me to keep record. No, Meredith had not planned the murder. But his negligence had made it possible. Poirot turned to the fourth page, Angela Warren. The only child present that summer. now a renowned archaeologist. Brilliant, intense, sharp-minded. Her loyalty to Caroline remained unshaken after all these years. She had implored Poirot to reopen the case, not merely for truth, but for her sister's honor. And yet, Poirot knew well that even the young could hold secrets. Angela had once thrown a paperweight at Caroline in a fury. Her own words. A childish temper, long overcome. But what else might have festered in the shadow of that grief? He had seen the scar on her face, long since healed, but always present. Lastly, Poirot looked down at the fifth sheet, Elsa Greer. Now Elsa Restarrick. Once the vibrant young mistress of Amias Crayle, later the wife of a businessman, and now a widow with wealth and detachment. She had spoken to Poirot with calculated candor. There had been no remorse, no sorrow, only cold recollection. I was young. He was a genius. I wanted to be his muse. Caroline couldn't handle that. She had insisted she did not know about the poison until the news of his death. She had left the garden to change for lunch. No one had seen her for nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Unaccounted for. Poirot rose from his chair and moved to the window, watching the rain blur the view of the cobbled street below. The clue, he felt, lay not in what had been done, but in who had known what Amias would drink, and when. Elsa had admitted she brought Amias a bottle of beer herself earlier that morning. Caroline had done the same later, according to testimonies. 2 bottles. But only one was poisoned. Poirot imagined the scene. The painter, absorbed in his canvas, trusting, distracted. Anyone could have approached, replaced the bottle, tampered briefly, especially if they had motive strong enough to override fear. But what was Elsa's motive? To be free of Caroline's interference? To secure Amias once and for all? Or had she, perhaps, suspected that she was being discarded after all, and acted not out of love, but revenge? Poirot turned back to the desk and placed a hand over Elsa's name. She had loved Amias with the possessiveness of youth. She had expected admiration, reward, permanence. Instead, she had been told, subtly, cruelly, that she was a passing distraction. And it was there, Poirot believed, that the seed had been planted. Not in jealousy like Caroline. Not in bitterness like Philip. Not in duty like Cecilia. But in betrayal. For some women, he knew, the wound of being replaced was sharper than the wound of abandonment. It cut into pride, into identity. And Elsa had been a girl used to winning. He tapped the name once, twice. Then turned to the window once more. Outside, the storm began to lift. The sky split into soft light, and with it came clarity. He now had the portrait. One with 5 faces, but only one wore the true mask of the murderer. Chapter 9. Truth in the Mirror. The drawing-room at Little Chartmall had the faded charm of once prosperous families. Threadbare Persian rugs, tarnished silver in the cabinet, and heavy curtains that muted the sunlight. In this worn but dignified space, Hercule Poirot had summoned the 5 individuals whose lives had orbited the tragedy of Amias Crayle's death. They arrived one by one. Angela Warren, composed and sharp-eyed, took the armchair by the fire. Philip Blake stood aloof at the mantel, his arms folded in a defensive knot. Miss Cecilia Williams chose a straight-backed chair and sat with the posture of a woman for whom rigidity was both armor and habit. Meredith Blake settled near the window, eyes uncertain behind round spectacles. Last to arrive was Elsa Greer, now Mrs. Restarrick, clad in pale grey, exuding practiced grace and cool distance, her presence as deliberate as a signature on glass. Poirot sat opposite them, a low table between them. The only sound for a moment was the quiet tick of an old brass clock on the mantel. "I thank you for coming," he said, his voice gentle, but unmistakably in command. "This meeting, as you may expect, concerns the matter of Amias Crayle's death. An event which has touched each of your lives for 16 years. He paused, letting the weight of that settle. "One of you," he said calmly, "has lived with a falsehood all these years. And now, the time has come to examine that truth, not only in the name of justice, but because the lies we carry, Miss Amos, shape who we become." Philip Blake let out a short, derisive breath. We already had a trial. Caroline Crale was convicted. She confessed. Poirot inclined his head slightly. "So it seemed. But she confessed not to the murder, Monsieur Blake, only to an intention. That is very different from guilt. Words spoken in despair do not always correspond to facts." He shifted his gaze toward Elsa. "I have spoken with each of you. I have studied not merely what was said, but how. I have looked for what was left unsaid. And now, I must ask you to listen not for vengeance, but for understanding." He turned toward Angela. "Mademoiselle Warren, you were but a girl at the time. Do you remember the moment Caroline brought Amias his beer?" Angela nodded slowly. "She brought him the bottle late in the morning. He asked for it specifically. I was with Miss Williams when we saw her walking out with it." "And she returned shortly after?" "Yes." Poirot's eyes shifted to Meredith Blake. "Monsieur Blake, the poison, quinine, was it possible for anyone else to access it?" Meredith cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Yes. It was in an unlocked cabinet in my laboratory. Foolishly so." Poirot's gaze now moved to Miss Williams. "You described Elsa Greer that day as possessive. What did you mean by that?" Miss Williams gave a small, tight nod. She followed him about like a child with a toy she feared might be taken. She was determined to secure him, and seemed entirely indifferent to the pain it caused Caroline. Poirot nodded solemnly. Then his voice shifted, quiet, deliberate. "Elsa brought Amias a bottle of beer that morning as well. Earlier than Caroline. Is that not so?" The room fell still. Elsa's chin rose slightly. "I did. It was the least I could do. He was working hard. You left it on the table beside him. He drank it slowly. Caroline brought him another bottle afterward." "Yes. I suppose she did." Poirot steepled his fingers. "And yet, it was only the second bottle, the one from Caroline, that was thought to be poisoned. Why? Because he died later, not sooner. A false assumption. Because poison is a subtle weapon. It does not always act instantly. Especially quinine, it takes time to enter the bloodstream." He let that truth hang in the air. Elsa's face remained impassive. But her hand, resting on her lap, twitched. "It was the first bottle that killed Amias Crayle," Poirot said. "The one you brought, Madame Restaric. And you relied on timing to cast the shadow elsewhere." Philip Blake gave a short, shocked bark of laughter. "That's ridiculous. Why would she?" Poirot turned sharply. "Because she was no longer his muse. No longer his great inspiration. He had told Caroline he was finished with her. That once the portrait was complete, she would be discarded. Not loved, not remembered." Elsa's eyes narrowed. "That's speculation." "None, madam. That is psychology." He rose and walked to the fireplace. "You were not the girl accustomed to rejection. You were Elsa Greer, the beautiful heiress. You were not used to being dismissed. That morning, he had called you tiresome, selfish, unnecessary." Poirot turned. He had finished the painting. "You saw it. And you knew in that instant that your time in his life was over." Elsa's voice was cold. "I didn't kill him." Poirot bowed slightly. "No murderer ever truly believes they are one. You told yourself it was poetic justice. That Caroline would take the blame. That Amias deserved it for making you feel small." He paused. "But Caroline suspected. She guessed what had happened, and confessed, hoping to protect you. Or perhaps only protect Angela from the scandal of a second betrayal. Angela inhaled sharply, her hands clenched in her lap. "I believe," Poirot said softly, "that Caroline wrote the truth in her letter to Angela. Not of guilt, but of sacrifice. The kind that only love, real love, can inspire." Elsa rose to her feet slowly. Her expression was unreadable. "You have no proof?" Poirot met her gaze. "None. Only your silence. And the truth that lives in your eyes now." No one spoke. The old clock ticked on. Elsa looked at each face in the room. Then, at last, her shoulders dropped. "I was young," she whispered. "I thought I mattered. When I found out I didn't, when he told me I was just a subject, something in me collapsed." She stared at the floor, her voice thin. "I brought him the bottle. I didn't even know for certain if it would work. But when he died, and everyone assumed it was Caroline, I said nothing. I told myself it had already happened. That it was done." Silence followed her words. Not outrage. Not weeping. Just the long, aching stillness of truth-finding air. Poirot straightened his cuffs, his voice gentle again. "Justice is not always vengeance. It is, at times, merely the restoration of truth." He turned to Angela. "Your sister did not die a murderess. She died with dignity, protecting the very people who once accused her." Angela's eyes were wet, but steady. "Thank you." Poirot looked at each of them in turn. "The past cannot be undone, Miss Amos. But it can be understood. And in that understanding, perhaps we find peace." Chapter 10. 5 Little Pigs. The wind stirred gently across the grounds of Little Champmole, rustling the tall grass near the abandoned studio where once Emirs Crayle had poured his passion into paint and canvas. The building stood empty now, a hollow shell washed with memory, and the afternoon light touched it like a fading photograph, soft, golden, and mournful. Hercule Poirot stood at the edge of the path leading down to it, hands clasped behind his back, his posture impeccable as always. He did not look toward the building. Instead, his gaze wandered the landscape, seeing not what stood before him, but what had once transpired across its lawns and stone paths. The past, he often mused, was never truly buried. It merely slept beneath layers of civility and time, waiting for memory, or truth, to stir it awake. Behind him, the 5 figures who had once shared the Crayle tragedy now dispersed, each carrying the weight of that truth in their own distinct way. Angela Warren lingered by the fountain, her fingers trailing through the water's edge. Her face, often guarded by the sharp wit of intellect, was now softened by reflection. The knowledge that her sister's last act had been one of protection rather than guilt had carved a fresh wound, but it was a wound of healing, not destruction. She no longer saw Caroline Crale as a martyr trapped in shame, but as a woman who had chosen love and sacrifice over self-preservation. That knowledge, strange and beautiful, gave Angela a deeper understanding of the woman she had mourned in confusion. Miss Cecilia Williams departed the grounds without a word. Her upright back did not falter, but there was a noticeable tremor in her step. For years she had clung to her disapproval of Caroline, never daring to look beyond the surface of the case. Now, the edifice of her judgment had crumbled. Not in scandal, but in humility. It unsettled her, and yet, in a way she could not quite articulate, it made her feel lighter, as though some tightly wound knot inside her had finally been untied. Meredith Blake stood by the hedge near the conservatory, arms folded, his brow furrowed in a pensive gloom. Of all those involved, his role had been perhaps the most passive, and yet the guilt he bore was no less real. The unsecured cabinet, the carelessness, the failure to see the poison within, not only in his laboratory, but among the people he called friends. He wondered how many tragedies might be prevented if one dared to look more closely, to ask the uncomfortable question, to observe with the attention Poirot had shown. He sighed and turned toward the house, resolving, quietly, firmly, that in the years he had left, he would no longer confuse peace with avoidance. Philip Blake was gone before the others. He had slipped away without farewell, retreating behind the mask of cynicism that had long protected his pride. But something in his eyes, when Poirot had spoken the truth, had changed. A flicker of unease. Perhaps even regret. He had not loved his brother-in-law, but neither had he imagined being complicit in an injustice. The facade of indifference he had worn for 16 years was beginning to crack. Whether anything would grow from within remained to be seen. And Elsa Greer, now Mrs. Restarrick, had departed last. She had not spoken again after her confession. She had stood still, quiet, composed to the end. But her eyes had dimmed. The mask of poise could not disguise the hollowness beneath. She walked away from Little Chantmal without the crisp click of heels, without the pride she once carried like armor. She walked not as a young heiress nor a scorned lover, but as a woman at last forced to face the truth she had buried beneath ambition and fear. Her future remained uncertain, but it would no longer be lived in a borrowed lie. Poirot finally turned from the path and walked toward the house. The sky above had begun to streak with amber. He moved slowly, not from age, but from reverence. He had uncovered the truth, yes, but in doing so, had reopened wounds, disturbed graves of memory, and forced mirrors upon those who preferred shadows. But truth, as he often said, was like the sun. It might burn, it might blind, but it could not be extinguished. As he reached the steps of the house, a soft voice behind him broke the silence. "Monsieur Poirot?" He turned to see Angela approaching, a folded piece of paper in her hand. "I found this. It's Caroline's letter. The one she wrote before the trial. I thought you should have it." Poirot took the letter carefully, eyes flicking across the worn paper. He did not read it aloud, but as his eyes scanned the lines, he nodded with solemn grace. "She wrote not to beg forgiveness," he said softly, "but to give clarity, even at the cost of her own name." Angela looked out over the lawn, her expression contemplative. "Do you think she ever regretted it? Taking the blame?" Poirot folded the letter and slipped it into his coat. "Perhaps, at moments. But not deeply. To love is not always to protect, it is sometimes to endure. And Caroline Crale, mademoiselle, endured everything for you." Angela nodded, her voice catching. "I wish I'd known." Poirot's gaze softened. "Now, you do." The shadows lengthened as the day drew to a close. Poirot stood for a long moment before descending the front steps. His time at Little Chantmal was finished. The mystery had unraveled, not in bloodstains or fingerprints, but in the hearts of 5 people who had lived too long in silence. As he made his way down the drive, the breeze picked up, rustling through the trees. The past had spoken, and the present had listened. And so, Hercule Poirot walked on, ever precise, ever solitary, ever committed to one truth above all others, that even the smallest lie, left unchallenged, could poison a life, and that the greatest justice came not in punishment, but in understanding. And so, the truth at last steps into the light. What began as 5 conflicting memories ended in one undeniable conclusion, drawn not from fingerprints or poison bottles, but from the quiet, relentless logic of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells. Justice may come late, but in Poirot's world, it always arrives, polished, deliberate, and undeniable. Thank you, dear friends, for joining me on this journey through time, motive, and memory. If you enjoyed unraveling the mystery with me, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts below. I always love hearing from you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Moonlight Audiobook for more classic mysteries brought to life. Goodbye.